II. And the way I'm going to do this, and let me see, I'm going to start with the timeline on this side. So I'm going to put, I'm going to start way back, 1933, 1934, 1935, 1936, 1937, 1938, 1939, 1940, 1941, 1942, 1943, 1944, 1945. Okay. Now I'm starting at 1933, and you remember why I'm starting in 1933? Why am I starting in 1933? That's when he gets elected, yes, very good. So I'm going to go ahead and put these guys up here. But I'm only doing it for reference. Because there are some things that happen, we mentioned this the last class, that were kind of a prelude. And so we need to remember the Kellogg-Briand Pact. And that actually doesn't get ratified or agreed to by Kellogg, which is the American Secretary of State, and Briand, the French, until about 1928. Okay? Prior to this, if you remember the Washington Conference, this was in 1923. These are all before things. It's important, though, because I'm going to now designate areas. So I'm going to talk about what is the U.S. doing. So we'll put him here. I'm just going to put dots. And I'm going to say, what is Western Europe doing? And so for this would include UK and France. I'm going to use a different color. The UK and France. Okay. And then I'm going to make a distinction between what UK, France, obviously Belgium, because they were the source of World War I. I'm going to then talk about what the East is doing. And in this case, we're going to talk about Italy will be first, Germany, and then Far East is Japan. Okay? And then I'm also going to have a little bit over here of where the far, far East is, which is the Soviet Union. Okay? So I put them in red. Now, in terms of the back time, the dates, just like we have already talked about the Washington Naval Conference, which is an example of U.S. not being completely isolationist after World War I. This was in 1921, 22, Kellogg-Briand Pact in 28. These are kind of examples that are showing how the West is moving closer to the American point of view. The United States does not agree to the Treaty of Versailles. The United States does not join the League of Nations. The United States is not even a part of the World Court. But it doesn't mean we're isolationists. It means we're observer. Because in 1918, 1919, 1920, we had a different view. We talked about this last unit. I don't want to get into it again. But we had this progressive view that we could truly change the world, make it safe for democracy, create democracy at a global level. But when Wilson comes back and the United States realizes that England and France had kind of convinced Wilson to pay for this League of Nations by also forcing Germany to admit that they were to blame. They had they had to accept blame, which meant that they had to pay a ton of money in reparations. They also had to eliminate their military for all purposes except for general police. They had to promise never to take the Rhineland, and all this is that territory right between France and Germany, that would be kind of a no man's land. And they also had to promise to never join up with Austria. This is the agreement with the Treaty of Versailles. For the most part, the United States really actually didn't mind the eliminating the military. We certainly didn't mind keeping people out of that region right next to France where you could be a threat. And we didn't really mind about not joining up with Austria, because these are all forms of military alliances. We did, however, mind this idea that somehow only Germany was to blame, because from the American perspective, everybody was to blame. And so you shouldn't have had winners, you shouldn't have losers. That's the part that caused the United States not to accept the treaty. But we weren't isolationists, and the examples were the Washington Naval Conference. 2 years later, we invited everybody to come over, and this was kind of an arms reduction meeting. We're going to limit the number of Navy ships. And in the 20s, Navy ships were kind of the equivalent of nuclear weapons. This was the biggest tool, biggest weapon in your arsenal. So if we could agree to limit that, then we'd be less likely to be trigger happy to get into war. This is Americans doing this. And the Kellogg-Briand Pact, if you remember, is when we are making an agreement to outlaw war. These are examples of not just the United States not being isolationist, but the United States really adhering to this rule of law identity. And by the time we get to 1932 and 1933, not only does the United States agree with this, but England and France and the winners of World War I are all also in agreement. But I made a point that it's kind of easy to recognize that you made a mistake when you won. It's harder to do that when you lost. And the same kind of backdrop that causes the West to look and recognize the rule of law, on the East side, they look back at history and their perspective is different. We mentioned this last class. 1915, after the Lusitania sank, the United States warns Germany, you cannot ignore the rules of law. You cannot ignore the rules of the high seas. You cannot ignore the rights of neutrals. If you do, and you continue to sink American ships, we're going to take this as an act of war and we're going to get involved. And Germany's response in 1915 was to respect the rule of law, and as a result, they just lost most of their navy. And so by the time they got to 1917, they had unrestricted submarine warfare. It was too late. So if you look at this in hindsight, what you could argue is that the losers of the lessons from the losers is that if they had followed a rule of might from the beginning, then this wouldn't have happened. If they'd have followed rule of might from the beginning, this wouldn't have happened. And if you look at all the players here, Italy never did join the World War I, but they had been allied with Germany prior to World War I, and as soon as the war starts, they say, we're out of it. And towards the end of World War I, they actually join in on the Axis side, but it was feeble-hearted in that they didn't get anything out of it, so they were not considered a winner by any chance in World War I. Germany obviously has to accept that they were at fault, so they're losing. Austria is in here. They also had to accept fault. The result of World War I on Austria was that their empire actually broke up, so they were no longer the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. They're Austria, then they're Hungary, and then same thing happened to the Ottoman Empire. They had to break up. They were Turkey. All their little parts became little countries. And so it's a loss all throughout here. Japan is the only weird guy on this side because Japan was on the winning side, but Japan wasn't really involved with World War I directly. Japan used World War I as an excuse to have an empire and to expand, and so they are using World War II for the exact same purpose. So it makes sense for them to be on the rule of might side because they want to gain an empire. The West rule of law is really kind of pushing away from the idea of empire and focusing more on this concept that all men are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. And so if you want to ensure peace, you have to have a government that protects that. On the East, not so much. The Soviet Union started off on the Western side at the beginning of this war, and then something like 3 months before the war ends, they surrendered to Germany before Germany surrenders. And it's because they had this revolution, then they had a second revolution, which was a communist revolution. They pull out, and so they're a loser even though they started off on the winning side. What unites all of these folks is that every one of these guys has a dictatorship for a leader. Mussolini gets in power in the mid-20s. Hitler gets in power in 1933. Soviet Union starts off with a dictator right after the revolution with Lenin in 1919. It takes about 2 or 3 years for that civil war to calm down, but by 1932, you've got Stalin, who is the dictator in Soviet Union. So they're all dictators. None of them accept the rule of law. All of them are based off of this rule of might. So this is where we stand in 1933. Now, the reason why I mention this is that in 1933, we do have a change. We know this because we talked about this in the United States. There is an economic downturn worldwide. We talk about the Great Depression in the United States, and we pretend as if somehow it is businessmen that caused this, but it's largely a natural adjustment of the demand that was artificially increased following World War I. It just took about 10 years. There was a downturn, so it affected the United States. It also affected Europe. It kind of had a global impact. This is important because in 1933, most of the people aren't really thinking about domestic issues. And to some extent, this is why Hitler gets elected. Now, for Germany, they've had a bad economy from throughout the 20s. It had nothing to do with a readjustment of demand. They were having to pay huge amounts of money in reparations. They were having to try to rebuild their government after the war, and they just had a terrible time throughout the 1920s. And so Hitler was rising kind of amidst that chaos, and he was promising to make a change. Now, I have had students with no subtlety at all say, well, to some extent, FDR is making similar promises. But please make sure that we distinguish this. FDR is democratically elected. Hitler is also democratically elected, okay? But FDR does not have gangs of thugs that kind of intimidate people. FDR is not systematically removing the democratic apparatuses. The government, or the American society, is not in chaos. There's very few similarities between the United States and Germany in 1933. So it's the best connection is that they were both elected, but they're not the same. The culture is different. And the biggest thing is that in Germany, as in Italy, as in the Soviet Union, the emphasis is on order. And you use might, power, force to ensure order. In the West, the emphasis is still on freedom. And so we use law as opposed to force in order to ensure freedom. So we have two different ideological positions. In 1933, Germany is weak. The country is in disorder. It explains why Hitler gets elected. In 1933 in the United States, in England and France, the economy is down, but it's not, the government isn't at risk. There's not disorder. This is important. First off, we'll take this kind of one step at a time. And I will shift over to let you see what's going on in the